Katherine of Aragon, remembered by history as the first wife of King Henry VIII, the wife he divorced, and the mother of the bloody Queen Mary. But who was Katherine prior to her marriage, and in her own right? Hello, my name is Hannah and I study royal history, and today we will be looking into the life of the Infanta Catalina of Aragon and Castile. If you're new here, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed. And into the video. Princess Katherine of Aragon was born Infanta Catalina on the 16th of December 1485 at the palace of the Bishop of Toledo at Alcalá de Henares. I have never taken a Spanish lesson in my life. I apologise for the pronunciation now. The youngest child of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and warrior Queen Isabella I of Castile. Their marriage was a dynamic and successful one. Her mother Isabella is quite remarkable for several reasons. Often regarded as the first Queen of Spain, as her marriage to Ferdinand united a divided Spain. Even more remarkable, Isabella gave birth to Catalina whilst at war, trying to complete their Christian Reconquista of Spain, or the Spanish Inquisition. And as such, the first 5 years of Catalina's life was spent following Ferdinand and Isabella's army. On the day that Catalina had been born, Isabella had been on horseback all day, gave birth, and was back in the saddle the next day. Catalina was left in the care of the nurses. A few days later, Catalina was baptized by the Bishop of Palencia. She was dressed in a christening gown of white brocade, lined with green velvet with a gold lace trim. Despite the brief bit of neglect that I've just described, Catalina's parents were as loving and attentive as was possible for monarchs of their time. Isabella cared deeply for all of her children and supervised their education, and there are records of Ferdinand buying dolls for his daughter. The children were kept close, and the loving relationship between Katherine and Isabella can be seen in Katherine's relationship with her own daughter Mary. It was noted that Katherine, out of all of her sisters, looked the most like her mother. As a toddler, Catalina had a pushcart to help her learn to walk, and she adored a drink known as rose honey and fruit jellies. Catalina's education had prepared her for queenship from the age of 2. Her father had been in talks with the King of England, King Henry VII, to arrange a marriage between his heir, Arthur, and Catalina. In March 1488, Ferdinand sent representatives to go see the 19-month-old Arthur Tudor to check for deformities. The English prince was dressed in gold, and Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed by what their representatives had reported of the young prince. However, the English king's reign was not secure, and they had concern about their daughter's safety. Their concerns would be confirmed with the rise of the pretender Perkin Warbeck in 1491. A year later, on the 14th of March 1489, the two kings signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo, which agreed that the Infanta Catalina would bring 200,000 crowns as her dowry. I think that's roughly about 5 mil today. And it was agreed that Catalina would go to England at the age of 14. This treaty was advantageous for both sides. England would get a boost on the world stage of politics, and Spain got an ally for a war against France. 1490 saw Catalina's eldest sister, Isabella, wed Alfonso of Portugal. The marriage was arranged, but the two were able to find love. Unfortunately, it would not last long, as Alfonso fell off his horse 7 months later on the 13th of July 1491 and died. June 1491, Granada, the last state to resist a united Spain, finally surrendered. A ceremony was staged to celebrate the occasion, to which Catalina and her siblings witnessed. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand continued to tour their kingdom, asserting their royal authority before taking up residence in Granada. After the fall of Granada, the Pope had awarded Ferdinand and Isabella the title of the Catholic Kings. After the death of Alfonso, Infanta Isabella returned to Spain, expecting to live out her life as a nun, but Ferdinand has her remarried to Alfonso's cousin, King Manuel I of Portugal, in 1497. The four infantas Isabella, Juana, Maria and Catalina were sent to the Palace of Alhambra in 1492, where they grew to maturity and were educated. Life at Alhambra was idyllic, and they rarely left their home, except for state occasions. Alhambra, which is situated in Granada, was the most spectacular of Spanish palaces, a paradise of marble courtyards and painted ceilings, crystal pools, and fountains. Ferdinand negotiated with King Henry VII that Catalina would go to England in 1498 when she was 12. On the 20th of January 1495, marriages were agreed for Catalina's siblings, John, or Juan, and Joanna, Juana. It was agreed that Juan would marry Margaret of Austria and Juana would marry Philip the Handsome in 1497 and in 1496 respectively. Margaret and Philip were also siblings and children of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Juana and Philip's wedding day arrived on the 20th of October 1496. They were wed in Leer. I think it's fair to say that Juana was a bit obsessed with her new husband, and she would fly into rages when he took mistresses. Her behaviour became troubling for her mother, who ultimately was powerless to do anything, and presumably it troubled her siblings too. On the 18th of March 1497 in northern Castile, Margaret, or Marguerite of Austria, was presented to the Spanish court. The boat that had dropped Juana off to Flanders transported Margaret to Spain in the sibling exchange. Catalina and her sisters Isabella and Maria were in attendance of Margaret's presentation. Catalina was wearing a gown of brocaded cloth of gold together with a crimson scarf and a black mantilla. Prince Juan and Margaret were wed at Burgos Cathedral in Castile on the 3rd of April 1497. Juan would die 6 months later on the 4th of October. The young couple were aged about 17 and were so infatuated with each other that Juan's doctors warned him to restrain his physical passions. His sudden premature death, after only 6 months of marriage, was diagnosed as overexertion in the marital bed. But Margaret wasn't alone, as she was pregnant with Juan's child. King Henry VII sent Catalina a blessed ring as a token of his fatherly affection, and later in the August, Catalina and Prince Arthur were formally betrothed at the ancient palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire. In the December, Catalina's new mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth of York, wrote to Queen Isabella asking to be kept informed of the health of her future daughter-in-law, whom we think of and esteem as our own daughter. Queen Elizabeth of York and Lady Margaret Beaufort asked Isabella and Ferdinand to ensure that Catalina practiced speaking French with Margaret of Austria, as this was the diplomatic language of Europe at the time, and neither Elizabeth or Margaret understood Latin or Spanish. They also recommended that Catalina get used to drinking wine over water, as you couldn't guarantee you wouldn't catch something from the English water. On the 2nd of April 1498, Catalina's sister-in-law Margaret of Austria gave birth to a stillborn, although some sources say miscarried a male fetus, so With no child and heir, Margaret returned to her father. I can imagine that Catalina would have been sad at this news of Margaret having to leave, as the two had struck up a friendship. Catalina would be faced with further sadness on the 23rd of August 1498, when her sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal, died from childbirth complications. Her son, named Miguel, survived, but he would join his mother 2 years later. Isabella's husband, Manuel I, would remarry, but not to who you expect. Isabella's husband, Manuel I, would remarry to Isabella and Catalina's sister, Maria. 1498 was also the year that Catalina was supposed to go to England. However, her arrival was pushed back again until September 1500, as Prince Arthur would then be 14 and capable of consummating the marriage. Ferdinand and Isabella were still concerned about Perkin Warbeck and the existence of the Earl of Warwick and the threat that they posed to their daughter. I don't know what happened next, but Henry must have been able to soothe the Spanish monarch's fears, as the proxy wedding for their children took place on the 19th of May, 1499, at Prince Arthur's manor house at Bewdley near Worcester. By the summer of 1499, Catalina was the only child left at Alhambra, as her other siblings had either travelled, like Juana and Maria, or had died, like Juan and Isabella. Prince Arthur wrote several times to his bride, of which only one letter survives, dated October 1499 and written in Latin to "My dearest spouse." In it, he acknowledges the sweet letters sent to him by her, which so delighted him that he fancied he conversed with her and embraced her. Oh, they're so cute! Ferdinand, however, wasn't as keen as the young prince seemed. He made it clear to King Henry VII that Catalina would not go to England all the time that the Earl of Warwick and Perkin Warbeck were alive. Also, what with the deaths of her two children, Isabella and Juan, Queen Isabella was reluctant to let her precious remaining unmarried daughter, Catalina, leave her. Isabella grieved deeply for her children and was now determined to secure a happy and safe match. Henry wanted to keep his powerful friend and sentenced the two men to death. They were beheaded in November 1499. In April 1501, Queen Isabella announced that her daughter Catalina was ready to go to England, and another proxy wedding took place at Bewdley on the 19th of May 1501, 2 years to the day since the previous proxy wedding took place. This second one was to make sure that nothing was found lacking from the first. Catalina left Alhambra for the final time on the 21st of May 1501 and headed to the port of Corunna, where she would take a ship to England. She arrived at Corunna on the 20th of July 1501, but Catalina did not set sail until the 17th of August due to high winds. The sea crossing was terrible. A violent storm blew up in the Bay of Biscay. Catalina was very seasick and later wrote to her mother to say it was impossible not to be terrified with the storm. The captain was forced to return to Spain. They tried again on the 27th of September 1501, when the winds had died down enough, and this time she did set sail for England. Catalina arrived in England at Plymouth on the 2nd of October 1501, where she was met with cheering and waving, and there were banners in the street. It was noted that Catalina, who will now be known as Catherine, could not have been received with greater joy if she had been the saviour of the world. While at Plymouth, Catherine ate and gave thanks, and a royal messenger was sent to inform the king of his daughter-in-law's arrival. Prince Arthur arrived at Bishop's Palace at Doxmerfield on the 4th of November 1501 with his father and the lords of the Privy Council. The King of England declared to see his daughter-in-law, but Count de Cabra and Donna Elvira informed him that Catherine was sleeping and was not receiving visitors. The king was fuming. He feared that the princess was ugly or that something was wrong with her. He argued with Cabra and Elvira, and in the end he was allowed into Catherine's chamber and was relieved that she was as pretty as he had been told. Catherine and Arthur conversed through an interpreter, and he later told his parents that he had never felt so much joy in his life as when he beheld the sweet face of his bride. Later that evening, Catherine entertained the king and his son in her chamber with music and dancing. In the morning, Henry and Arthur took their leave to prepare for the wedding, due to take place in 10 days' time. On the 9th of November 1501, Catherine arrived at Deptford. She was welcomed by Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and Henry, Duke of York. They then conducted her to her lodgings in Lambeth Palace. Catherine made her state entry into London on the 12th of November 1501. Sir Thomas More, who was in the crowd of people hoping to catch a glimpse at her, wrote, "She thrilled the hearts of everyone. There is nothing wanting in her that the most beautiful girls should have. Everyone is singing her praises." Catherine had a wide gown on with a gathered skirt over a farthingale with bell-shaped sleeves. This style of dress was uncommon to the English, and the hooped skirt was not very flattering. As Catherine was short, and the skirt, well, it made her look as wide as she was tall. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth, who were wearing crowns and velvet robes trimmed with ermine, watched the procession from a window in Cheapside with their son, Prince Arthur. Catherine then rode back to Lambeth Palace, and the same eager crowds appeared 2 days later for the wedding. Catherine and Arthur were wed in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November 1501. Henry, Duke of York, had the honour of giving Catherine away. Catherine wore a white satin Spanish-style dress with bell sleeves and a fully pleated skirt over a farthingale. On her head she had a huge white silk coif, edged with a border of gold, pearls, and precious stones. Her ladies following behind wore similar attire. At the wedding banquet, Catherine, now Princess of Wales, danced in a very regal manner, clicking castanets, while Henry, Duke of York, not so regally, whipped off his gown and whirled his sister Margaret across the floor, leaping and twirling to the music. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London blessed the bed, and the newlywed couple were left alone behind closed curtains. Whether they did or not is a matter for another day. The next day Arthur was boasting about how he had been in Spain and that marriage was thirsty work. But I think that's more of a 15-year-old's ego talking. Arthur wrote to his Spanish in-laws Ferdinand and Isabella, telling them how happy he was and assuring them he would be a true and loving husband all of his days. Catherine would begin a lifelong friendship with Margaret Plantagenet. Margaret was the first cousin of Elizabeth of York and around 15 years older than Catherine. Margaret and her husband, Sir Richard Pole, were part of Arthur's entourage, and this is how the two women most likely met. On the 21st of December 1501, Catherine and Arthur left Baynard's Castle for Ludlow. Catherine was used to the warmer climate of Spain and travelled by litter, wrapped in furs while everyone else rode on horseback. Arthur's health had been iffy prior to leaving, and the cold, bitter winds would not have improved his health either, and they arrived at Ludlow in the January of 1502. The Prince and Princess of Wales caught a virus during March of 1502. Catherine made a full recovery, but for Arthur, this would be the beginning of the end. Arthur would fall victim to the disease on the 2nd of April 1502. It is thought that he died of the sweating sickness. Catherine had been raised for queenship since she was 2 years old, and now it looked like it was all in vain. For now, Catherine's future was unknown. Arthur's death left her alone in a foreign country, and she sunk into depression. Catherine travelled to Richmond Palace, where she was greeted by her mother-in-law. The two women found comfort in their shared sorrow, and Queen Elizabeth would act as a mother figure to Catherine for the short time that she had left. Both Henry and Ferdinand were desperate to find out if Catherine was carrying an heir, but the men had varying tactics. Ferdinand tried to find out discreetly by asking courtiers, while Henry asked her outright. Catherine claimed she was still a virgin. The death of Arthur caused Ferdinand and Henry to argue about Catherine's dowry, as it had only been partially paid. Ferdinand then pushed for a new marriage arrangement between Catherine and Henry, Duke of York. This match would allow King Henry VII to keep Catherine's dowry, and the final payment would be made once the marriage had been consummated. It was rumoured that King Louis XII was trying to block the betrothal, as he wanted to set up a French marriage for the Duke of York. King Henry VII and Catherine's parents agreed on the match, and King Henry VII wrote to Isabella, recounting his conversation with Catherine. Isabella wrote back announcing that she was satisfied that Our daughter remains as she were here, a virgin. Life after Arthur's death was pretty dull. It was not seen fit for a widow to dance in public or take part in court entertainment, so she spent her life with religion, needlework, and a quiet sociability in the Queen's apartments. Not exactly the life a 16-year-old dreams of, and thus the idea of marrying the 11-year-old Duke of York was rather appealing, as it would end the misery. In February 1503, Catherine's mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth of York, went into labour, and neither mother or child survived. After Henry had somewhat recovered from his depression over the death of his wife, he was still arguing with Catherine's father Ferdinand over her dowry, and he began negotiations for him to marry Catherine himself, so he could keep her dowry. Catherine's mother Isabella was horrified and blocked the match, commenting that a marriage between King Henry VII and Catherine was a thing not to be endured. Isabella suggested widowed Joan of Naples as an alternative bride, but nothing came of this. Not wanting to lose Catherine or her dowry, he abandoned his plan on marrying Catherine herself and proceeded with the marriage treaty for his son Henry to Catherine. The marriage treaty was signed on the 23rd of June, 1503, and the couple were formally betrothed 2 days later. The marriage was set to take place in 1505, when the Duke of York was 14. Ferdinand and Isabella requested a dispensation for the match from the Pope, similarly to what happened with King Manuel and Catherine's sisters Isabella and Maria. The Pope, Julius II, issued the Bull of Dispensation on the 26th of December 1503, in spite of the fact she may have consummated her first marriage by carnal knowledge. Henry, Duke of York, was invested as Prince of Wales on the 18th of February 1504. Catherine was enjoying her freedom at the English court, dancing, smiling, and kissing courtiers on the lips when they arrived. Her governess, Donna Elvira, was less than impressed and wrote to her father about her outrageous behaviour. Ferdinand replied that Catherine must behave as was fitting for her honour and dignity, and Henry VII said the princess must obey her father's orders. In 1504, Catherine fell very ill. She was very pale and had a fever and was unable to eat. It is thought that this was down to her not being able to adapt to the English climate. I was born here and I still haven't adapted. It was feared that Catherine may die, and Prince Henry wrote to her parents. Queen Isabella was also ill, but Catherine was unaware of her mother's illness, and while Catherine improved, Isabella declined. On her deathbed, she voiced her inner doubts about the validity of the Pope's dispensation, but she was largely ignored. Queen Isabella of Castile died on the 26th of November 1504, and her death had a catastrophic effect for Catherine. Her father, Ferdinand, was not her heir, so the Kingdom of Castile went to Catherine's sister, Juana. News of Isabella's death didn't reach England until December. Catherine was now the daughter of tiny Aragon and not the mighty Spain. So Henry VII was considering other brides for his son, and in the meantime stopped Catherine's allowance as he hadn't received her full dowry. By the February of the next year, Catherine could not afford to pay her servants. Ferdinand refused to support her financially as he viewed it as Henry's responsibility. Henry fed her, but he saw it as Ferdinand's responsibility. Catherine's gowns were becoming shabby, and she couldn't afford to get them fixed. Henry, Prince of Wales's 14th birthday came and went, and no wedding had occurred. Prior to the prince's birthday, King Henry VII had marched his son before the Bishop of Winchester and made the boy revoke the promises made at his betrothal on the grounds that they were made when he was a minor and incapable under the law of deciding such things. This secret meeting was to ensure that if a better match presented itself, then there would be no difficulty in breaking his pre-contract to Catherine. In the October, Henry entered secret negotiations with Catherine's sister Juana for a marriage between the Prince of Wales and Juana's 6-year-old daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor was a much better match than Catherine, as her mother was Queen of Castile in her own right, and her father was heir to the Habsburg territories, and might one day be Holy Roman Emperor. Catherine had no idea why King Henry was treating her so coldly in the December. She asked her father to make a substitute payment of gold for the jewels and plate in her possession. He agreed, but by April 1506, King Henry VII was complaining bitterly about the delay, as Catherine had led him to expect a second payment. This wasn't Ferdinand being difficult. Under the terms of the marriage agreement, he didn't technically have to pay until the couple had consummated their marriage. In January 1506, Juana and her husband Philip got shipwrecked off the coast of England, and King Henry welcomed them at Windsor Castle. The men saw this as an opportunity to continue marriage talks between Henry and Eleanor. Catherine hadn't seen her sister since Juana had left Spain to get married, and she was looking forward to reconnecting with her sister, and had hopes that Juana may be able to improve her situation. But Juana's mental health wasn't great. Juana was depressed and was only interested in her husband and her problems, not Catherine, and it became apparent that, after a decade apart, they had grown apart. While Juana and Philip were in England, King Henry put on great theatrics, making Catherine a prominent part of the festivities. He gave her new dresses, and she was sat next to her sister-in-law Mary. This was a far cry than what Catherine had been experiencing, but it painted a picture that Catherine was well looked after. However, Catherine was always under Henry VII's watchful eye, and was only allowed 30 minutes alone with her sister. He was cautious about letting her spend too much time with Juana in case she voiced her complaints about Henry's treatment of her. Not that he had to worry, the girls had very little in common anymore, and so Catherine didn't even attempt to ask her sister for help, sensing it would be futile. Philip and Juana left England in the April, and the two sisters would never see each other again. Catherine's financial situation had become so dire that she had to sell her dowry plate and jewels to try and maintain her appearance and household. By the late summer, King Henry VII allowed Catherine and her fiancé, Henry, to spend time together. The two became close, and the Prince of Wales never hinted at his secret rejection, and he referred to her as my most dear and well-beloved consort, the princess of my wife. Now, I'm not sure what Henry VII was expecting when he puts two teenagers together, but he didn't like that they were getting close, so he sent Catherine away to Fulham Palace. In March 1507, King Henry VII was tired of waiting for Ferdinand to cough up the dowry, so he gave him 6 months to pay up, and he warned him, "Many other princesses have been offered in marriage to the Prince of Wales, with greater marriage portions." In April 1507, Ferdinand wrote to Catherine asking for her opinion for the next Spanish ambassador, and in her response, she warned her father about what might be reported about her shabby attire and her servants wearing rags. Ferdinand had been unaware of his daughter's situation, although I do wonder how, since he refused to financially support her, but he was impressed with how Catherine had handled the situation, as it could have been a political upset, and so she was appointed as the Spanish ambassador on the 19th of May until her father could find a more suitable replacement, and she became the first female Spanish ambassador in England. Women had never acted in such capacity before. Her new role enhanced her status at court. She learnt court politics and was very good at the job. After bouts of illness due to stress, being ambassador allowed her to regain some of her natural colour. During this time at the English court, the royal family were very pro-Spain and anti-French, and as a result, the idea of Henry marrying Catherine became more appealing. and as such she was present at the tournaments held for the prince's 16th birthday, although this did nothing to bring the wedding any closer. She wrote to her father in the July and said, "Nothing has changed," which understandably was causing her distress. King Henry's wife, as we know, died in 1503, and since January 1507, he had been pursuing Catherine's sister, Juana, as his new bride, as Philip died not long after they returned from England. Henry spoke to Catherine and discussed his intentions to marry Juana. As he had already met her, he knew what she looked like, and her mental illness didn't bother him, as she was only going to be a consort. Catherine supported the match in hopes that it would mean her and Prince Henry's marriage would materialise. But when she wrote to her father, he told her to tell the King of England that it was not yet known whether Queen Juana will be inclined to marry again, although it was certain that if she became so inclined, it shall be no other person than the King of England. In the September, Catherine took advantage of her situation and Ferdinand sent her 2,000 ducats so she could clear her debts, buy new clothes, and pay her servants. King Henry, not wanting to be outdone by Ferdinand, and also wanting to impress him so he could wed Juana, started paying Catherine an allowance. Ferdinand would lead Henry on with the prospect of marrying Juana until 1508. Unsurprisingly, their relations worsened in March 1508, when Henry was informed that Juana was too ill to marry, and he realised that marriage would not be happening. He dropped his interest in Juana and in Catherine. Catherine's replacement as the Spanish ambassador arrived in the spring, and with it, her power and respect at court evaporated. In January 1509, King Henry VII's illness became apparent, and he was unable to find a better match for Prince Henry. So, he was considering the idea of Catherine, as he feared for the succession. King Henry had stopped Catherine's allowance once the marriage with Juana was off the table. She sold all of her household goods to make ends meet. She wrote to her father in early 1509, telling him of her suffering, her depression, and how she felt she could not endure much more, as she might do something that neither the King of England nor your Highness would be able to prevent. Heartbroken that his daughter felt that life wasn't worth living, Ferdinand finally made the dowry payment that King Henry had been after for years. But when his ambassador, Don Luis Carlos, went to find the English king to inform him, the king was too ill. King Henry admitted on his deathbed that he thought he might have treated Catherine too harshly, and that he wanted his son, Henry, to make amends and do the honourable thing and marry her. King Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509, and his son, Prince Henry, became King Henry VIII. The new King of England was hesitant at marrying Catherine, as she was his brother's widow, a big no-no, and something that would come to haunt him 2 decades later. But Ferdinand reassured Henry that the Pope had given a dispensation. The marriage would bring an alliance between England and Spain. Ferdinand told Catherine he loved her, the most of his children, and looks on the King of England like a son. Ferdinand also explained how 2 of Catherine's sisters had married the same King of Portugal, and that was fine. The Privy Council also urged the new king to marry Catherine and fulfill the treaty. The king agreed. There were many good reasons for the marriage, but above all, he told them he desired her above all women. He loved her and longed to wed her. So on one day in early June, King Henry VIII went to Catherine's apartments, dismissed her attendants, and declared his love for her. When he asked her to be his wife, she happily agreed. I can imagine her sitting there like, "Finally, you took long enough." Catherine and Henry were wed in a private ceremony on the 11th of June 1509. Catherine wore Virginial white, just to highlight the fact she was still a virgin and had not consummated her marriage to Arthur. Her hair was down, she wore a gold circlet, and vowed to be bon air and bosom in bed and at board. The new king and queen then had a joint coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 24th of June 1509, where Catherine once again wore white. After her marriage to Henry, Catherine ditched the Spanish farthingale and adopted an English dress sense. Good, because by all accounts, Catherine, that Spanish dress did nothing for you. January 1510 was exciting for two reasons. One, because Queen Catherine was already pregnant, and Henry ordered the construction of the infamous Mary Rose, named for his sister, and its sister ship, the Peter Pomegranate. The pomegranate was his wife's symbol, representing fertility, so this ship was clearly named for his wife. However, after their divorce, spoiler alert, the ship was known as just Peter. On the 31st of January 1510, Catherine felt a pain in her leg and went into labour. The child was stillborn. This wasn't uncommon for a first pregnancy, but that didn't stop her guilt or depression at the loss of a child. Henry, to his credit, tried to reassure and comfort Catherine, which must have worked because she got pregnant again pretty quickly. And this second pregnancy lifted her spirits, and she was certain that this time it would be a healthy baby boy. It was around this time that we think Henry took Anne Stafford as his mistress. Henry used Sir William Compton as a go-between. Anne would eventually have an affair with Compton, and a pissed Henry sent Anne away from court in retaliation. Queen Catherine was furious. Despite her father's infidelity, her parents had a loving relationship, and this was one aspect her education had not prepared her for. Catherine berated Henry, and he didn't understand what the issue was, as remember, it was normal for kings to have mistresses, and he had tried to be discreet. He did not intend to publicly humiliate her, like she was doing now. He tried to do it in secret, guys. That's true love, right? Right? Catherine was criticised by many at court for her behaviour in handling her husband's affair, and from then on, she learned to turn a blind eye. And I thought I would include this, as you can see a stark contrast to how she handles Henry's first affair and his last affair in their marriage with Anne Boleyn. With Anne, Catherine doesn't bat an eyelid, as Henry has been doing it throughout their marriage. And as was proven in this instance, if she did complain, nothing changed. Catherine would give birth to a son named Henry after his father on the 1st of January 1511 at Richmond Palace. The celebrations for his birth lasted almost as long as the tiny prince's life. He was christened at Richmond Palace on the 5th of January, and his godparents were the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Surrey, and the Countess of Devon. Henry could not do enough to praise and honour Catherine for delivering his heir. The whole kingdom engaged in joyous celebrations, and the most extravagant of jousts was held to celebrate. The king's armour was engraved with the intertwined H's and K's, and he jousted under the name of Coeur Loyal, Sir Loyalheart. However, on the 22nd of February 1511, the young Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died. The king and queen were distraught, and he did his best to yet again comfort her. But there is no evidence that Henry himself outwardly mourned. The boy was given a lavish funeral. The king relied heavily on his wife for advice during his early reign, and would often say, "The queen must hear of this," and would rarely take action without discussing it with Catherine first. And I think she enjoyed feeling like this, like she and Henry were a team rather than just being a passive queen. I also think Catherine's time as the Spanish ambassador gave her the experience of being a helpful companion when it came to politics. In June 1513, Henry went on campaign in France, and he appointed Catherine as regent in his absence. In the summer was the Battle of Spurs, which we initially won because the French fled before any real fighting could happen, but England wasn't able to retain what they had won, so I guess in the long run it was a loss. And then on the 9th of September was the Battle of Flodden, where Catherine really shone. The Queen was heavily pregnant at the time, and she mirrored her mother, who would also go on campaign and be at war while pregnant. Catherine herself had been born during a war. The English fought the Scottish at the Battle of Flodden, which we won. The biggest casualty of the battle was the Scottish king, King James IV. Catherine revelled in her win and proposed sending King James's corpse to her husband in France as a trophy. However, even her English soldiers thought it was a bit too gruesome, so instead she wrote to him, as in Henry, "This battle hath been to your grace and all your realm the greatest honour that could be, and more than ye should win all the crown of France." Despite the victory, the stress of the battle must have been too much, as Catherine's baby, the one she was pregnant with during the Battle of Flodden, was a stillbirth. Henry returned to England in the October. Catherine quickly got pregnant again, but this was another stillbirth in 1514. It was around this time that Henry would start seeing one of his most infamous mistresses, Elizabeth Bessie Blount. At this point, Catherine had had 4 pregnancies. She was a few years older than her husband after all, and she had been intended for his older brother, and her looks were starting to fade, while Henry was becoming a handsome young man. To compensate, Catherine took a leaf out of her mother's book and dressed herself as magnificently as she could. On the 18th of February 1516, the royal couple finally welcomed a healthy baby. It was a girl named Mary. Henry was disappointed that she wasn't a boy, but still hopeful that he and Catherine would have more children. "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God the sons will follow." And he called Mary a right lusty princess. Catherine was very maternal and protective of her daughter, a fact that would never change. In the June, Catherine's chief confidant and lady-in-waiting, Maria di Selina, married William Lord Willoughby. They would go on to have a daughter, whom they named Catherine after the Queen. The Queen was also the baby's godmother. In May 1517, King Henry and Queen Catherine were having a picnic in Greenwich when they were informed of a fight that had broken out between the apprentices of London and the Europeans who had arrived. I'm assuming it's the same old backwards argument of the foreigners are taking our jobs. The King's Guard got the rioters under control, and Henry was determined to avenge the outrage committed against the foreigners who had arrived under his protection, as Europe at the time was unusually in a time of peace. As a result, Henry condemned the apprentices to death.
"You're fired."
But Catherine, who was sat on her throne, couldn't bear to watch, so she knelt before him and in tears begged him to spare the apprentices. Thomas Wolsey knew that an act of mercy would increase the popularity of everyone involved, and so he too pleaded for the king for mercy. Wolsey and Catherine were right, and the king spared them thanks to the influence of his wife. 1518 was Catherine's last pregnancy, and as the previous pregnancy resulted in a healthy baby who was now 2 years old, Henry made an utter fuss of Catherine, making sure that she had everything she needed, as he knew all too well at this point that a healthy baby was not a guarantee. King Francis I of France blamed Henry's lack of heir on his decision of marrying a woman older than himself and said, "My good brother of England has no son, because although young and handsome, he keeps an old and deformed wife." Unfortunately, like the majority of her pregnancies, this one would not produce an heir for her husband. We mentioned earlier that Catherine was struggling to keep up appearances. Her figure was ruined by pregnancies, and she was aging quicker than her husband. But Henry did not once reproach Catherine on her looks, or for his lack of a male heir. Unfortunately, wives 2 and 4 didn't have the same luxury. Henry had been clean-shaven until 1518, and then he grew a beard. He then said that he would not shave his beard until he had met his new ally, King Francis. But Catherine hated his beard, and in November 1519, forgetting his agreement with Francis, shaved it off. Francis was furious when he met with a clean-shaven Henry at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. But Catherine stepped in, and Francis found it amusing that a mighty sovereign could be influenced by his wife like that. In January 1519, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian died, and his grandson, Catherine's nephew, became Emperor Charles V. On the 15th of June 1519, Catherine would face the ultimate humiliation when her husband's mistress, Bessie Blount, gives birth to a healthy baby boy, who is named Henry after his father. And the birth of Fitzroy is really the beginning of the end for Catherine, as in Henry's eyes, it means that he isn't the issue. Catherine is. He can provide a son. It's Catherine that can't. This is also the time he starts to have doubts about his marriage. I do wonder if Bessie Blount had given birth to a girl, or the baby had miscarried. Would Henry have divorced Catherine? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. In May 1520, Charles V came to England in hopes of forging an alliance. Catherine is elated as she had never met her nephew, and as Catherine knows, having powerful family members is always a good thing. I thank God I shall see his face. And actually, if you think about it in this day and age, it's actually quite a sad thought that she had never met her nephew up until this point. The Field of the Cloth of Gold, one of the most expensive failures in history, occurred between the 7th and the 24th of June in France. This peacocking event achieved nothing, and the peace they were trying to create only led them to make more alliances with other people. However, the two queens, Katherine of England and Claude of France, got on very well, and the two women bonded over religion. The Dowager Queen of France and Catherine's sister-in-law, Mary Tudor, was also there. On the 25th of June, the English court went home, while Catherine and Henry hosted a banquet for the new Emperor Charles, much to the displeasure of Francis. You know, the guy who Henry basically spent the last 2 weeks trying to make peace with. In 1522, the Boleyn sisters also returned to England, although Mary Boleyn had actually been there slightly sooner than that, and Anne joins the Queen's household. By 1524, Catherine had started the menopause, so more children was out of the question, and so far Henry only had 2, a girl and an illegitimate boy. Henry had considered legitimising Fitzroy, and even a marriage between the half-siblings.
Gross.
But there was no way of knowing if the English subjects would accept such a match. In August 1525, Henry sent his daughter Mary to Ludlow Castle, the traditional home for the Prince of Wales, and to all extent, it looked like that Mary would be his heir, or the Princess of Wales, just without the official title. That same year, Fitzroy was given the dukedoms of Richmond and Somerset, and appointed Lord High Admiral. This greatly offended Catherine, as this illegitimate child was being treated like a legitimate prince. And if that was the case, what's to say that the child or his mother doesn't take precedence over her or her child? Although ultimately we know that will never be the case. In the summer of 1526, King Francis I offered himself as a husband for the Princess Mary, as his wife Claude died in 1524. Henry was enthusiastic, Catherine not so much, and nothing would come of this match. And although Henry and Catherine stopped sleeping with each other, they still put on a united front in public, appearing at events together. Christmas 1526, the Princess Mary came to Greenwich, and I can imagine this was a happy reunion for mother and daughter, as Catherine had not seen Mary since August of 1525, and Mary resides at Ludlow in Wales, which isn't exactly close to London. In 1527, Henry, who had been doubting his marriage the past 3 years, has convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was against divine law, and the deaths of his children were because God was angry with him, as he had married his brother's widow and started to quote Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 20. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. It might sound slightly flippant or silly to say now, but you have to remember how deeply religious people were in the 1500s. And Henry would have felt this with every fibre of his being. Henry asked Pope Clement VII to help with an annulment. However, there was two issues with this. Pope Clement was a prisoner of Emperor Charles V, the nephew of Catherine, during 1527 to 1528. The other issue is the previous pope issued a dispensation so that they could get married in the first place. If Pope Clement goes back on that, then it suggests that the previous pope was wrong, and the pope is God's representation on earth, so the pope can't be wrong, because if the pope is wrong, then God is wrong. Unsurprisingly, the pope refused to grant a divorce or an annulment. Emperor Charles V cared about family honour, and a divorce would tarnish his aunt's honour. He also had an alliance with England through Catherine, and losing England would weaken his forces, and seeing as he was his prisoner, Pope Clement refused the divorce, so he didn't enrage Charles. By 1527, Henry had started to court Anne Boleyn, allegedly in Runnymede underneath the Ankerwick yew tree, and he may have even proposed there. So Henry wanted to divorce Catherine for 3 reasons: no male heir, new love, and she was Spanish, which was no longer fashionable, especially as Henry now wanted a French alliance. Again, this could be down to Anne's influence, having been raised at the French court. Deciding he didn't need the Pope, Henry turned to Cardinal Wolsey and told him to fix it. And that's a direct quote. I know, I was there.
Really?
No, not really. I can't back that up.
Wolsey tried 3 different attempts using the Bible and Leviticus, but for reasons mentioned earlier that didn't work. Then he tried to free Pope Clement from his imprisonment by forming an alliance with France, but the emperor was too powerful and France chickened out. His 3rd attempt was to hold a divorce proceeding in England, as Cardinal Wolsey was the Pope's representation in England, so he should be able to do it. However, Pope Clement wanted to prolong the proceedings, hoping that Henry and Catherine would sort out their differences. So he requested that Cardinal Campeggio attended the divorce proceedings in his place. Campeggio was tasked with stringing out the proceedings for as long as possible, which he did. Believing that his divorce was well underway, Henry proposed to Anne Boleyn, and they agreed to marry when he was free to do so. Anne had the king's ear, and was carefully introducing him to the reformist faith. And don't get me wrong, I don't think he was ever a Protestant. I think Henry was a Catholic until he died. But I think the Protestant faith had a few things in it that were convenient, and that he liked the sound of. Catherine, meanwhile, is pleading with Henry to see sense, that their marriage is lawful, and to not go through with the divorce. Henry is unswayed, and is getting frustrated with Wolsey, to the point that his failure to grant Henry a divorce is what led to Wolsey's downfall. Henry even accused Wolsey of working with the Pope and not the King. On the 21st of June 1529 was Catherine's moment. She threw everything on the line, and although she didn't win the war on her divorce, this battle at Blackfriars was definitely her win. Both she and the King were called to Blackfriars for an examination of the validity of their marriage. Henry claiming that Catherine must have slept with his brother Arthur, otherwise why would God be mad at him, and Catherine maintaining that she was a virgin untouched when she became Henry's wife. The court was mainly filled with reformers or those in the ever-growing Boleyn faction, so Catherine knew that the court wasn't in her favour, as Henry wanted to marry Anne. Catherine knelt before her husband and begged him to stop the divorce proceedings, but he refused. She countered, saying that she would appeal to Rome. "I must humbly require you, in the way of charity and for the love of God, who is the just judge, to spare me the extremity of this new court, until I may be advised that way and order my friends in Spain will advise me to taken. And if ye will not extend to me such impartial favour, your pleasure then be fulfilled, and to God I commit my cause." The crowd that saw Catherine travel to Blackfriars cheered, and she received a loud applause. What is so groundbreaking about Blackfriars is the woman who never puts a toe wrong, who is conservative, pious, elegant, and the epitome of a true queen, ignores the formality of the court and what is expected of her to make this desperate plea to her husband. And even more shockingly is the fact that Henry allows her to do so. Leniency I don't think he would have shown to any of his other wives. George Cavendish records, "Sir, I beseech you, for all the loves that have been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman, and a strange born out of your dominion. I have here no assured friend, and much less indifferent counsel. I flee to you as the head of justice within this realm. Alas, sir, where have I offended you, or what occasion have you of displeasure that you intend to put me from you? I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. I have been pleased and contented with all the things wherein you had delight and dalliance. I never grudged a word or countenance or showed a spark of discontent. I loved all those whom ye loved only for your sake, whether I had cause or no, and whether they were my friends or enemies. This 20 years and more I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had divers children, though it have pleased God to call them out of this world, which have been no fault of me. And when ye had me at first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man, and whether it be true or no, I put it to your conscience. If there be any just cause by the law that you can allege against me, either of dishonesty or any other impediment to put me from you, I am well content to depart, to my shame and dishonour. If there be none, I must lowly beseech you, let me remain in my former estate and receive justice at your princely hands." Henry said nothing. He stared past his wife. When she had finished, the Queen curtsied and left, ignoring calls for her return, and she was met with the same cheers and applause of support from onlookers that she received when she entered Blackfriars. The court ordered her to appear again, but she refused. She had said her piece and appealed to Rome. After Catherine left, Henry declared she had been as true, as obedient, as comfortable a wife as I could in my fantasy wish or desire. He acknowledged that he had been lucky to receive such a marvellous queen. "As God is my witness, no fault in Catherine moved me." He then reminded the court that all of his legitimate sons had died incontinent after they were born. He believed that he had been punished by God. Henry then made it clear that he had brought these proceedings not because he disliked Catherine or her age, but because he felt that God was angry with him. He then said that Catherine, with whom I could be well content to continue during my life, if our marriage might stand within God's law. Evidence that Henry was happy in his marriage to Catherine, and makes me wonder, if she had provided an heir, would they have ever got divorced? Let me know in the comment section down below. In March 1530, Pope Clement VII forbid Henry VIII from contracting a marriage before a decision was made from the divorce proceedings, and then in the September, the Pope, desperate, suggested that Henry had 2 wives, as being a bigamist would be less scandalous than having an annulment. Henry's sister Margaret had been given an annulment, but this annulment would suggest that God was wrong, and that's why the Pope was so against this divorce. Emperor Charles V had offered an imperial invasion on Catherine's behalf to end her troubles through the 1530s, and Catherine continually refused due to her loyalty to her husband, and wanted nothing to do with the plan. Wolsey tried and failed to fix his reputation in 1529, but was stripped of his post as Chancellor, all of his properties were seized, and he was replaced by Sir Thomas More. Wolsey is accused of treason and ordered to the Tower of London, but he would die on the journey there on the 29th of November 1530 from ill health. The death of Thomas Wolsey made it very clear that the Pope was not going to grant an annulment. The king was saddened by the news of Wolsey's death. "I wish he had lived," he remarked. In March 1531, the Princess Mary fell seriously ill, most likely caused from the anxiety of her parents' pending divorce and uncertainty for her future. She hadn't kept food down for 8 days. Catherine, being the caring mother that she is, wanted to go see her only child. Henry agreed that she could go to Mary, but if she did, she should stop there. Catherine now faced a choice: go see her ill daughter who needed her, but risk her illegitimacy, or stay with her husband and fight for her daughter's future and place in the line of succession. I mean, it was a painful decision, but Catherine chose to stay by her husband's side, and no doubt she was praying for her daughter's recovery. By the 24th of March 1531, Mary was still ill and showed no sign of recovery. Henry, finally showing some concern about his daughter's condition,
Don't make me come up there and be a parent!
First time for everything!
Ho ho ho!
and having felt guilty about depriving his daughter of her mother, he arranged for Mary to be brought by litter to Richmond Palace, where Catherine would join her. Mother and daughter were reunited, and by April, Mary was well again. Catherine returned to court and left her daughter in the capable hands of her friend Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Over the next few weeks, Henry continued to press Catherine about withdrawing her appeal to Rome about the annulment, but stubborn Catherine claimed, "I am his true wife." Frustrated by Catherine's lack of cooperation, he moved the court from Windsor to Woodstock early without telling the Princess Mary, Catherine, and her attendants. Henry had left a messenger who informed the Queen that she had a month to vacate the castle. Henry and Catherine would never see each other again. Catherine told the messenger to convey a message to the king. She was sad he had not said goodbye. The king, hearing her message, fell into a violent rage, crying, "Tell the Queen I do not want any of her goodbyes and have no wish to afford her consolation. I do not care whether she asks after my health or not. Let her stop it and mind her own business. I want no more of her messages." At Christmas that year, Catherine sent Henry a gold cup. She and Henry always exchanged gifts, even the past few years, when things had been rough. Much to her surprise, he sent it back, and commanded her not to send him such gifts. Catherine saw her daughter for the very last time in January 1532, when Mary visited her mother at Enfield. Neither Mary or Catherine knew this would be the very last time that they would see each other. Henry kept them separate, as he feared together they might intrigue with the emperor against him, and keeping them apart was a good way to punish Catherine for her obstinacy. In 1532, the Act in Restraint of Appeals was passed. This act meant that Catherine could no longer appeal her divorce to the Pope and Rome. It had to be the English Parliament. In doing so, Henry had hoped he could offer Catherine a large settlement and she would go quietly into a convent, but she declined. Thomas Cromwell's political star was rising, and he led a revolution that called for the English Church to separate from Rome, using the divine right of kings. the belief that the king was God's representative on earth and that Henry had been chosen by God. This would lead to England officially separating from Rome and the Church of England being born. Henry would be the head of the Church of England and wouldn't need to answer to the Pope, and Thomas Cranmer was made the Archbishop of Canterbury. That Christmas, Anne found out she was pregnant with Henry's child. Meanwhile, Catherine spent Christmas practically alone at Enfield, ever under the watchful eye of Thomas Cromwell's spies, who were making sure that she wasn't able to communicate with the Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis. King Henry VIII wed Anne Boleyn in secret at Whitehall Palace on the 25th of January 1533. This marriage wasn't technically legal, as he was still married to Catherine, as the annulment hasn't been complete. Henry banished Catherine to Amt Hill in February 1533, so she was far away from Anne and Henry, who were in London. On the 9th of April 1533, the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk informed Catherine that the king had remarried, and that she should refer to herself as the Princess Dowager of Wales. She could keep her property, but, just like 30 years ago, the king would not pay for her servants or household expenses. Catherine was calm at the news, but not abiding. In Henry's mind, Catherine was now his ex-wife. Their marriage was never legal, and that Catherine should refer to herself as the Princess Dowager of Wales, the title she had held while married to his brother Arthur. But stubborn as ever, Catherine kept referring to herself as Queen, much to the annoyance of Henry and his new queen, Anne. Thanks to the combined efforts of Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, the king's great matter was finally over. Henry and Catherine's marriage was annulled on the 23rd of May 1533 and denied contact with the Princess Mary. Cranmer declared that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was legal and valid on the 28th of May 1533. Anne Boleyn's coronation pageantry began the next day, with the coronation on the 1st of June at Westminster Abbey. The new queen was not as popular as Catherine, and Anne gave birth to a girl, like Catherine had, on the 7th of September, named Elizabeth, after both of their mothers. Upon Elizabeth's birth, the Princess Mary was declared illegitimate and downgraded to a lady. I imagine Catherine was furious, as she had strived to protect her daughter and her legitimacy, but ultimately, Catherine was powerless to do anything. In December 1533, Catherine, living at Buckden, which was cold and damp, caused her health problems. Henry was going to send her to Fotheringhay, but she locked herself in her chambers as she knew that the conditions were worse. At Christmas, her lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour was moved from her household to that of the new queen, Anne Boleyn. He's only 7 years late, but, better late than never. The Pope finally declared his judgment on Catherine and Henry's marriage on the 23rd of March 1534. He said that the marriage always hath and still doth stand firm and canonical, and the issue proceeding stand deaf, lawful, and legitimate. He then ordered Henry to reconnect with Catherine and leave Anne, otherwise he would be excommunicated.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
But the Pope no longer had any authority over English affairs, and hadn't done in years. And although Catherine was happy at the news, nothing changed. Catherine was moved again from Fotheringhay to Kimbolton in the May. In 1535, Anne Boleyn was feeling threatened by the existence of Catherine and her daughter Mary, despite the fact she's got the guy, the crown, and Henry is slowly killing his ex-wife by putting her in awful accommodation. Is that not enough, Anne? Chill? Anne told Henry that she was visited by God in a dream, and that it would be impossible for her to conceive a child while Catherine and Mary lived. Now, at this point, Anne had conceived several babies, but Elizabeth was the only child she was able to carry to term, and as a result, she could feel that her position was fragile. The ironic thing is, though, that by getting rid of Catherine, Anne would actually be losing her safety net. Not that she could see that. Henry, however, didn't rise to Anne's bait. This is also the year that Henry starts to execute Catholic heretics, so Catholics who objected to the Church of England. The most infamous was the execution of Henry's friend Sir Thomas More, and Henry also had his Catholic teacher, Cardinal John Fisher, beheaded for disagreeing with his plans for the Church of England. He also put his head on a spike and showed disrespect by leaving the headless body naked for a day. Although I don't have any evidence of Catherine's reaction, I don't think it's much of a leap to say she would have been horrified and maybe even see Henry as a monster. Catherine was super religious and has been called pious on more than one occasion. So, in my head, it would have played out like the scene between Padme and Anakin from Revenge of the Sith. You know, where Padme is like, "I don't know you anymore. Anakin, you're breaking my heart."
You're going down a path I can't follow.
Because of Obi-Wan.
Because of what you've done, what you plan to do.
I'm just imagining the same with Catherine looking at Henry and being like, whoa, this guy's turned into a proper monster. Anyway, I digress. Anne was pregnant again in November 1535, and so she made another attempt to get rid of Catherine. And it worked just as well as the first time. Anne feared for her and her daughter Elizabeth's safety, and although Henry didn't buy his wife's words, she didn't need him to, as Catherine fell dangerously ill. Years of living in cold and damp castles had taken its toll on Catherine's health. It briefly looked like Catherine might recover in early December, so Anne tried for a third time, third time's the charm, to have Henry execute Catherine and Mary, but Henry knew that Catherine's health meant that she didn't have long left, so he did nothing. On the 30th of December 1535, it was very clear that Catherine did not have long left. The Spanish ambassador, Chapuis, informed the king of her condition. Henry's response was cold. When she is gone, the emperor will have no further excuses for interfering in English affairs. Chapuis was shocked at his callousness, retorted, "The death of the queen will be of no advantage. His imperial majesty will never abandon her while she lives." To which Henry shrugged and gave Chapuis permission to go visit her, which he did. The Lady Mary also wanted to visit her dying mother at Compilation Castle, but Henry refused. Chapuis had not seen Catherine in 5 years and noted that she was so wasted that she could neither stand nor sit up in bed. Catherine's former lady-in-waiting and friend, Maria de Salinas, forced her way into Catherine's chamber, and Catherine was thrilled to see her friends. Chapuis would leave Catherine on the 4th of January 1536 in the hands of Lady Willoughby, but before he left, Chapuis saw Catherine's doctor. Chapuis knew how important deathbed confessions were, so he asked the doctor to get Catherine to swear that her and Arthur never consummated their marriage before she died. It's not much, but it's the last favour he could do for his friend and queen. In her final days, Catherine retreated to her chamber and refused to see anyone who would not address her as queen. The night before she died, Catherine wrote a letter to Henry where she declared, "Mine eyes desire you above all things," and in a last stand of defiance, she signed the letter, Catherine, the Queen. Katherine of Aragon, first wife of King Henry VIII and former Queen of England, died on the 7th of January 1536 at the age of 50. We don't know what exactly killed Catherine, but an autopsy revealed that all of her organs were normal, except her heart, which had a black growth on it, and it was black on the inside. Obviously, diagnosing 500 years later isn't always the most accurate thing to do. I mean, look at the amount of illnesses and diseases King Henry VIII apparently had. However, in this case, I think our modern medical knowledge may help. It is thought that Catherine may have died of a malignant tumour. Tudor doctors would not have known this, so for them, the evidence was pointing to poisoning, and as such, her autopsy report was hushed up so they didn't provoke a retaliation from Spain. Anne Boleyn, unsurprisingly, would be blamed, and many believed that she had poisoned her rival. Chapuis informs the king of Catherine's death, and he said, "God be praised that we are free from all suspicion of war." And Anne declared, "Now I am indeed queen." And if that wasn't enough, 2 days later they held a court ball to celebrate England's liberation from the threat of war, and the royal couple wore yellow. Now this can be interpreted as two ways. One, it's a celebration that Catherine is dead and won't bother them anymore, and they are wearing yellow as it is a joyous colour. Or two, they are actually celebrating being free from the threat of war and wore yellow because this is the royal colour of mourning in Spain. I'll let you decide what you believe. Catherine was to be buried as the Dowager Princess of Wales, not Queen of England. Despite this, Henry made her funeral as extravagant as he could. Again, is it because he is happy that she is dead, or a showcase of love to the woman who had stood by his side for decades? Catherine's funeral took place on the 29th of January 1536. Henry wore black and Anne wore yellow. Anne then complained that everybody kept talking about the dead Catherine and not her. Catherine was buried in a grave marked Dowager Princess of Wales at the Peterborough Abbey, now Peterborough Cathedral. When Catherine died, much of Europe hailed her as a hero of the Catholic faith, much like how her parents had been the Catholic kings. In her will, Catherine left her daughter the collar of gold which I brought out of Spain and her furs. Her last request to Henry was for her gowns to be used to make church garments. And, being the cold-hearted man that he is, Henry didn't reuse her gowns nor pass the items on to their daughter. The only justice Catherine would receive was about 400 years later, when Queen Mary of Teck ordered a symbol of queenship be hung above Catherine's resting place, and she has two banners, one bearing the royal arms of Spain, and the other the royal arms of England. And that is the life of Katherine of Aragon. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share it with a friend, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. But until then, have a wonderful day.